right, welcome to the Cwic Media Come Follow Me series. This is the Old Testament. We are covering the creation story this week. I want to start off by just backing up real quick here for a second and talk about Moses 1 and Abraham 3 again. Remember that these are the precursors, the preludes to the creation story and the Garden of Eden story. So we're going to be right in the middle of this. This is simply a continuation of a vision. This is important to understand that we sometimes, because of Genesis 1, we kind of start off this as this creation story just sits by itself. It doesn't. There is a vision by Moses before this. There is a vision by Abraham before this. The creation story and the Garden of Eden story simply continue this vision along. So what we must do here in order to gain greater context of the creation story is understand what we've gleaned from Moses 1 and from Abraham 3 first, because as it is a continuation of these same visions that these prophets had, we're going to have the same type of themes. We're going to have the same principles that are being used, and we're going to gain greater context by bringing these things together into a single vision as we should. As an example, if we go back to Moses 1, again, what do we see here quickly? We see in verse 40, "And now, Moses, my son, I will speak unto thee concerning this earth." This is where we're going to get the creation vision, portion of the vision, right? "Upon which thou standest, and thou shalt write these things as these words, which I shall speak." Right? There's our DBR, where that's one of the principles we're going to carry through from Moses 1 and from Abraham 3. Okay? And then in Abraham 3, at the end here, we get the story of the war and rebellion in heaven, in the premortal council in heaven that we all participated in. Here's 27 and 28, the last two verses in Abraham 3. "And the Lord said, Whom shall I send? And one answered, Like unto the Son of Man, here am I, send me. And another answered and said, Here am I, send me. And the Lord said, I will send the first. And the second was angry and kept not his first estate. And at that day many followed after him." So we can see how easily the creation story and then going into the Garden of Eden story is going to be a continuation of this same battle that we have here in the premortal world. So it's a continuation of the same vision. And again, I'm going to harp on this before we get going into the texts on this, about this being a vision. And that's how we need to understand this as a vision. It is not a historical account. I cannot say that enough times because it is so hard for us to get out of that mindset. It is a vision that is likely taken and put onto paper and then perhaps even put into a drama, right? So that we would have something for the temple. It is temple liturgy. And it was basically brought in for the temple, which is why we have it in the temple today. And the principles that we learn from Moses 1 and Abraham 3 are going to carry through into Genesis 1 and 2 and into Moses 2 and 3 and into Abraham 4 and 5, right? The creation story that we're going to get here. So if we keep that in mind, then we can learn the principles of the creation story. And we can have a better understanding of why it is in the temple, which is an ascension experience for each of us, as from the very beginning going all the way through the endowment process. What does the creation story teach us about ourselves and about the plan of salvation? So the DBR was a major part of that, the word coming down from one level to the next, that being a part of hierarchy. The hierarchy is stressed very strongly, especially in Abraham 3. This has a lot to do with the council in heaven. And there is order that is being put into place here. And if we look at facsimile number 2 with Abraham 3, then we can see also that there is this idea of the the order from one level to the next, from one planet or star to the next, and then from one spirit to the next, we get the idea of light coming down through that hierarchical structure. It's the light, it's the word, the DBR of God. It is the order, the priesthood that's going through that hierarchical structure. So starting off then in Genesis, let's just go to verse 1. And in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Okay, so again, this to me, I said this in the last episode, but this to me is the most misleading verse likely in all of Scripture, because without the context that we have from Moses 1 and Abraham 3, we start to think of this as the beginning of a historical account. We need to understand that, number one, in the beginning, that is already disputed as to being really the right translation. And secondly, whenever we see the beginning, our first thought should be geared toward the council in heaven, in the premortal world. That is day one of the creation. And that is the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon, or in the tabernacle. It's where God's throne is. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. If I step back from looking at this scientifically and I look at principles, I'm already seeing something very important here. Something we discuss a lot on this podcast is the higher and the lower laws. So we're getting a separation here already. There are the heavens and there are the earth. Remember that in talking about covenant, we must have a cutting of the covenant. It's got to be separated. And then it is to be brought back together. And then when it's brought back together, it is made stronger through that process. And that is why in the grand scheme of things, in the plan of salvation, you have a fall, that's a cutting, a separation of the covenant, right? And the first part of the covenant. And then you have your way working back toward God, which is keeping the covenant, right? And moving back toward him, which is at-one-ment or atonement. And God, being a loving God, does the same thing. We fell, but regardless of our fall, he is also going to move toward us. How is that done? It's done through the condescension of God. That is the higher law. And so when we look at the heaven and the earth, we can also look at this as heaven is the higher law and earth is the lower law. We can even look at this, I would, as heaven being the Melchizedek priesthood and earth being the Aaronic or carnal priesthood. That's what they represent, is those two separate higher and lower laws. And see, I can look at these things better if I'm not trying to look at this as some account being taken down as oh, this is just a history of how the creation happened. Now, a couple of changes that we get when we go to Moses 2 and we see verse 1 here, we get a little bit of a different beginning here than what we have in Genesis. Here's the big difference here. Starting off, it's new verbiage here. It says, and it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Moses. All right, first of all, DBR. He spake unto Moses. These are not accidental. This is how the creation happens, through the word, through DBR. Saying, behold, I reveal unto you concerning this heaven and this earth. Now, again, what's very interesting is that when Moses goes up on Sinai, he comes down with the higher law, the Melchizedek law. The children of Israel reject it. They create the golden calf. They are sinning. Moses breaks the Melchizedek law tablets, goes back up Sinai, offers himself up as an atoning sacrifice, as Christ would for the people of Israel, and then receives a new law, and he comes back down with the Aaronic law. So you can look at that even as a way of looking at, okay, well, the heaven was created, and then the earth was created. And then it says, write these words, DBR, which I speak, DBR. Again, heavy focus on this. I am the beginning and the end, the Almighty God, by mine only begotten, I created these things. We've seen other phrases that talk about God, right? It's as Alpha and Omega, or the beginning and the end. Also in Moses 1, we have the word of my power, the word, the logos, the DBR. And then it follows up, and some of this is the same as Genesis 1. It then says, in the beginning, I created the heaven and the earth. And then he adds in there, upon which thou standest. So again, for Moses, he's already given this grand scope of things, that there are many other worlds, but now I'm going to talk about this world that you are on yourself. This is mortality, and I'm going to show you how mortality came about. And then the difference in Abraham 3, and we're not going to do this for all the scriptures, but I just want to show some of the differences here. In Abraham 3, Abraham 4, we get, and then the Lord said, let us go down. So we get a plural version of this. And this we know is plural because, we know the DBR. We know the order, the hierarchical structure. So of course it's let us go down, right? Because you have Elohim, you have Jehovah, you have Michael, you have us. You have a group of individuals that are involved in the creation process. And that order, that hierarchical structure that is in place, is essential, imperative for any type of creation to happen. It's a simple continuation. So when it's us, we're talking about a hierarchical structure already in place, and then let us go down. That is a condescension part of creation, and it's moving from the heaven down to the earth. It continues, and they went down at the beginning, and they, that is the gods, plural, organized and formed the heavens and the earth. So again, the organization here is what is crucial to understand. Now, again, looking at temple imagery and drama, another interpreter we work with, if they say they organized and formed the heavens and the earth, number one, we know that this is true because we don't believe in creatio ex nihilo, right? Which is creation out of nothing. So there is a process. It's an important thing to see. We are organizing. That's why the hierarchical structure is so important. That is in itself an organization, right? You've organized, and now you're going to continue to organize material that already exists. As Joseph Smith says, the elements are eternal. But the other thing we see in here, if we're talking about the temple, because the temple is a microcosm of the creation account, is what it is, right? And when it says, and they organized and formed the heavens and the earth, we can start thinking a little bit about, well, you're creating the temple here, or the temple gets created along the same lines as the creation story. So you have an order with different levels. You have the word that has to be passed on from level to level. You have a place for the heaven, the celestial kingdom, the throne of God, which for us today is the celestial room, has been the Holy of Holies in the previous temples and tabernacle. So as Moses takes the vision that he's having here, we're talking about Abraham, but same idea here, and Abraham may have done the exact same thing. We just may not have a record of it, but Moses takes that vision and then translates it into the architecture, structure, process, and drama and covenants of the temple. All right, then going back to Moses 2, and that's mostly where we're going to draw from, we get, and the earth was without form and void, and I caused darkness to come upon the face of the deep, and my spirit moved upon the face of the water, for I am God. Okay, so we have void, we have the deep, we have darkness as we get in Abraham on this verse. It's darkness reigned. And only the earth had been created, but nothing had been organized on the earth yet, right? So here comes something we already have from Abraham 3. And that's the light that comes through the hierarchical structure, whose original source is Christ. Verse 3, and I, God, said, let there be light, and there was light. You see this again in facsimile 2, where the light passes from level to level, from planet to planet, from star to star. And I, God, saw the light, and that light was good. And I, God, divided the light from the darkness. So here is another principle that is going to continue throughout the creation that we've already had in Abraham 3 and Moses 1, and that is order and covenant. Right? Again, we're dividing these things apart. You cut a covenant, karat berit. That's how the Hebrews said, make a covenant. They cut a covenant. So these things are being divided and organized and put into a certain order, just like we had previously with Moses 1 and with Abraham 3. And then we get in verse 5, and I, God, called the light day, and the darkness I called night. And this I did by the word of my power. And it was done as I spake. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So there's our word of my power, and as I spake. There's our DBR. This is the principle that creation passes through, is from the communication. It's both the light that passes through, it's the word that passes through. And ultimately, the source of the word and the source of the light is Jesus Christ, is Jehovah. But he says here, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So again, if we take a fundamentalist, scientific, Concordian view of the creation, where we think it's history, where we think it's scientific, then we become, for example, young earth believers. And we say, okay, well, it was created in 6 days. Or if you're LDS, and we're going to get to Kolob here again in a minute. And you say, well, the Kolob, we're told that 1,000 years on Earth is 1 day for the time frame of Kolob. So maybe it wasn't 6 days and then the seventh day he rested, but it was 6,000 years, and then the 7,000 years he rested. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Again, we're not talking about running a documentary on how the earth was created. That is not what this is. In Abraham, we get the term time, the first time, the second time, the third time, right? And oftentimes in Hebrew, yom, which means day, is also represented or is used as a representation of a period of time. So we don't need to try and figure out. I know that's kind of fun sometimes to go through what is the exact time frame of all of this. How do we find that? But if we do that and we're looking at a scientific and quite frankly lower law explanation for all of this, we're going to miss out on what's been given to us here. This is spiritual language. It's higher law language. So why lower yourself down to the lower law, to a carnal scientific reasoning type of language, instead of greater truths, which are spiritual in nature and symbolic? Now, as we continue down in Moses 2, we then get, and again, this is verse 6, and again, I, God, said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, or an expanse. This is what we get in Abraham. And it was so, even as I spake, and I said, let it divide the waters from the waters, and it was done. Okay, so again, what are we getting? We're getting division. We're getting order. We're getting organization. These are principles that we can apply to our own lives. As we go through this creation process, we should be thinking about the concept, the principle of creation and what that means. It's not just the creation of the earth, it's the creation overall of anything, including ourselves, right? Because we ourselves become new creatures as we are born again, as we create ourselves through our agency and obedience to the laws of God, or our disobedience to the laws of God. But we are creating ourselves, and so we should look at these principles in the same fashion. How do we organize? How do we divide when necessary and then bring back together into one? In verse 7, and I, God, made the firmament and divided the waters. So this is day 2 that we're getting here, right? The second day. And again, if we're looking at temple imagery, we'd be looking at the veil as the firmament or the expanse. And day 1 would be in the Holy of Holies, the council in heaven that is held there, the hierarchical structure of God on his throne, of others around him. Angels, concourses of angels might be there. We might have the seraphim / cherubim and others that are there representing this hierarchical structure that we get in Abraham 3. Lehi sees the same thing in his vision in 1 Nephi 1.